Organize, classify, and that's what it boils down to. It's a great big classification system. You see, you have nouns, and then you can break nouns down into common nouns and proper nouns. You can break nouns down into singular nouns, plural nouns, collective nouns. You can just take the system and keep subcategorizing, subcategorizing, subcategorizing. That's an assumption about language and how you would approach the study of language. So traditional grammar, they are great taxonomizers. The only thing is their taxonomies aren't logical, because you shouldn't be able to end up with the same word in two different categories. In other words, my should not be both a pronoun and an adjective simultaneously. There should be, some way you define your taxonomy so it's one or the other. But it still very much is taxonomy.
Does traditional grammar work, is it more accepted in languages that are closer to Latin?
Yep. In fact, that's a nice segue, actually, into structural grammar, believe it or not. Question?
I like what she just said. And is it because the people that were reading and writing and translating at the time were reading, writing, translating Latin?
Well, see,
right?
We really don't have English grammars until probably the mid-17th century, because there was no need for them. The language of scholarship, the language that people felt to be in need of regulation, was Latin. And Latin didn't, in a sense, need regulation because there were no native speakers. It was a dead language, but yet it was used for scholarship. But then during the 17th and 18th centuries, the vernacular languages of Europe, like Spanish and German and French and English, begin to be used for scholarly purposes, for religion and philosophy and science. And so it's at that point they feel that these languages need to be regulated. Well, how are you going to regulate them? Well, the only grammars in town are essentially grammars of Latin, used to teach scholars this dead language that they would use for their scholarship. So when people began to write grammars of English or Spanish or German or French, they just brought Latin and Greek concepts almost wholesale into those languages. Now, problems we have in the analytical system of English traditional grammar come from the fact that English and Latin are not of the same smaller family. In other words, Latin is an italic language, which would include its descendants like French and Spanish, Portuguese, etc. English is a Germanic language. But both the Germanic languages and the Italic languages share a common ancestor farther back in time. So in other words, Latin comes from this Italic, what's called Proto-Italic. That was the mother language of Latin. And you get Thaliscan, and you get Oscan and Umbrian, and a whole bunch of other languages that are dead coming from Proto-Italic. Whereas English comes from Proto-Germanic. And that gives us all the Germanic languages like English and German and Swedish and Norwegian and Icelandic. But even though you can see why there wouldn't be a perfect fit between grammars designed originally for Italic languages and Germanic languages, both of these languages go back to a still earlier language called Proto-Indo-European, which existed probably about 5,000 years ago, which means that they're going to at least share some common properties because at one time they were the same language. Now, Proto-Indo-European splits into these two, and they go their merry way, and so that merry way means that the Germanic languages and Latin become more diverse, but at least they continue to share some of those common Indo-European characteristics. Now, structural grammar in the United States begins when people start to look at some other languages. And those other languages they begin to look at are
Sanskrit?
Nope. Now, Sanskrit actually is part of the Indo-Iranian branch of Indo-European.
Native American?
Native American languages. In other words, Remember we said that structural grammar begins around the year 1900. Now, the thing is, it begins in a whole bunch of different places almost independently. This is kind of weird. It's hard for us to imagine today academic communities being as isolated as they were. But even a little over 100 years ago, American researchers in various areas weren't exactly up to date with some of the stuff that was going on in Europe and vice versa. And this was especially true in language study. So structuralism emerges in different places, but there are incredible similarities in structural theory. In other words, it's just as if certain ideas were ripe to appear, and they appear in different places. So you have American structuralism. You have structuralism appearing in England. It's called Firthian, the Firthian School of Linguistics. You find it appearing in France and Switzerland. This is called the Geneva School of Linguistics. You find it appearing in Eastern Europe. It's called the Prague School. So the Prague School, the Firthian School, the Geneva School, the American School, they're all structuralist. And yet they're doing all these similar things, but they're not, there's no common journal that they're all subscribing to. There's a lot of independence going on. And so the origins of American structuralism, although structuralism in America shares many characteristics with what's going on in Europe, the origins are totally different. Our focus originally was Native American languages. Now, you want to describe Native American languages. So you're going to use traditional grammar, right? It is laughable because
it's based in Latin.
They are not, traditional grammar is based on Latin. And we've seen that even English has problems adapting Latin grammatical theory, despite the fact that Latin and English share an ancestor that goes way, way back called Proto-Indo-European. But the Native American languages, as far as we can tell, they aren't related to the Indo-European languages. In other words, if there was a common origin, it's lost to us in history. That would go back so far in time that we could not possibly identify it. These languages are strange in a lot of ways. For example, in a language like Navajo. In Navajo, a verb of handling, that would be a verb that refers to something you do with your hands, like pick up, okay? Verbs of handling in Navajo take endings, okay, just like we have endings, like the ed for past tense. Verbs of handling in Navajo take endings which reflect the shape of the object handled. So if I'm going to pick up paper in Navajo, I add an ending to my verb which indicates that the object that I'm picking up is rectangular. If I pick up a piece of chalk, there's an ending that goes on the verb that indicates that I'm picking up something which is cylindrical. Okay, now, give me some traditional ways of looking at verbs. Tense, okay, time. Well, what tense is that shape business? No. Voice, as in the active and passive, no, it's not voice. Mood, if you're familiar with that concept, that's how the action's completed. No, that's not mood. Well, we've kind of gotten rid of all the verb categories. See the problem? There's nowhere to put this. You can't even cram it into Latin categories because it's so different from Latin. I mean, we're cramming some square pegs into round holes when it comes to English, putting them into Latin categories. And it kind of works, but it's not perfect. But when you start getting into languages that are wildly different in structure, like these Native American languages, you're not going to be able to use Latin and Greek categories. It was absolutely hopeless. So, if you're going to describe those languages, you're going to deal with those languages, then you have to do what?
So,
well, that's another assumption these structuralists make. And in America, it's also related to Native American languages. In other words, language isn't written anymore. Language is spoken. Because how many Native American languages wrote? North America, South America, Central America. Probably one, the Mayans, and that was it. So if you define language based on what is written, and you want to study Native American languages, you've got a problem because they're not written. So you've got to deal with the spoken form. And that's what they did. So language is spoken. And people in Europe are also getting this idea that they weren't studying Native American languages, but they were also getting this idea that, hey, fundamentally languages are spoken, not written. We've been in error here. Now, why would they be spoken and not written? What evidence?
We've had languages longer than we've had writing.
Yeah. Writing systems are about 5,000 years old, and that's it. No, writing is not talking about pictures on cave walls, but I'm talking about writing systems only 5,000 years old. And we know that there were languages like Proto-Indo-European and beyond that existed thousands of years before that. So that doesn't make any sense to talk about languages being written. So we have the historical argument. Right now, on this planet, 90%, or somewhere between 90 and 95% of the languages out there as they exist today aren't written down. So if we identify language too closely with writing, what are we going to do with these 90 to 95% of the linguistic systems in the world? So Europeans began to look at this stuff and say, hey, we've been wrong. We want a different orientation to language. Our focus should be on the spoken form, not the written. But in the United States, the particular slant of that argument was based on Native American languages, where, again, if I want to take Navajo, or I want to take Apache, or I want to take, Creek, and do an analysis of that language, I'm going to have to work with native speakers. I'm going to have to work with the spoken form because these people don't have any writing system. Okay? Now, when it comes to the analysis, what am I going to do? Well, the Greeks and Romans tell us how many parts of speech.
Okay.
According to the structuralists, how many parts of speech? See, we run into problems with categorization of these Native American languages. So their answer to the question, how many parts of speech are there, is it depends. It depends on the language. In other words, they said, if you're going to look at language analysis, you're going to have to analyze that language in its own terms. So if that language has 56 parts of speech, so be it. There's nothing magical about the number 8, although we did see that at one point in our grammatical development that people did see something, divine in it. But you look at the language itself. The language should speak for itself. You don't impose the structure of one language on another. Something else that the structuralists believe in their way of looking at language. See, why am I studying Native American languages if I'm a early 20th century American structuralist? Why am I studying the languages? They're dying. Even today, as we speak, Native American languages are dying. More and more of them die each year. So what are they trying to do with these dying languages? They're trying to preserve them. Now that doesn't mean they're trying to teach Native Americans these languages. I mean, because people were going to learn languages for utilitarian purposes, and if those languages don't have utilitarian purposes, they're going to die. So when we say that they're trying to preserve them, they're trying to preserve them for history. Before, when the last speaker dies, we're still going to have a corpus of data for that particular language. Now, if you're doing that, what's going to be your general orientation to that language? Are you going to be prescriptive? No, why? Why would you not be prescriptive? It's the same. In other words, you're trying to preserve the language, so you don't want to tell these people what they should be doing. You want to describe what they're doing. So this approach is descriptive. And again, in Europe, even though they're not dealing with Native American languages, people like Ferdinand Saussure, who is really considered to be the father of structuralism. Some of you probably ran into him when you were taking English 237, Introduction to Literary Research and Analysis. This structuralist approach to language was transferred to literature. It was transferred to anthropology because there are a lot of interesting ideas going on here among these people as to how you take a look at various entities, whether it's language, literature, or culture. So Saussure is saying the same thing. We should be describing the way languages work, not worrying about fixing them up. So the approach is inherently descriptive. The analysis is done in the language's own terms. Language is spoken. Tell me some other things about structural grammar, those of you who've had a little bit of this before. Well, there was a question we said that the traditionalists never got into, and that was the question, where does language come from? Not in terms of chicken versus egg, but in terms of learning. How do we acquire language? And they had an answer for that. Now you have to put this in the context of the time. So they start to associate with a certain psychological school. What psychological school is dominant at the beginning of the 20th century into the middle part of the 20th century?
Psychoanalysis?
Well, the Freudian stuff would be in terms of psychoanalysis, but think of it simply in terms of learning theory. How do you learn something? Behaviorism. In other words, they spend a lot of time talking about how languages are learned. That becomes an interest for them, a question that they begin to ask. And if we kind of reduce behaviorist model of learning to its basics, how does it work? Now this is a good little model for all kinds of things. We're going to see that the generativists didn't think it was a particularly good model for how languages are acquired, but
Reinforcement.
it's reinforcement. In other words, you start off with, so you're right again, nothing, the so-called blank slate or tabula rasa, okay? And then you fill up this slate by being experienced, which translates into being stimulated. The stimulus causes a reaction or a response, and then the response
It's reinforced.
is reinforced. That's how you learn language. Okay, so to use V.F. Skinner's famous example, a baby has gas. The gas in the baby's stomach causes the baby to burp. The gas is the stimulus. The burp is the response. And then
The feeling of relief. Is
No.
reinforcement.
But see, what we're going to try to do here is to get to language.
The parents will say
See,
something
the
about
parents
it.
step in at this point, and they want kids to make noises that we call language. So the parents start making all kinds of fuss over this little kid who's just burped. Oh, cutesy, cutesy, excuse you. Those types of things. And the kids, sitting there thinking, hey, I make this noise, and
Get
they
attention.
come running and they do all these strange and marvelous things to me, so I guess
Do it again.
I'll do it again. And then the burps become sounds, and the sounds become syllables, and the syllables become morphemes, and the morphemes become words, the words become sentences, and now we're talking about truth be, but it's all from a burp. That's the model. But they adopt this behaviorist view because that's the dominant show in town. Okay, so very different attitude about the nature of language. We're going to describe it, not prescribe it. We're going to describe it in its own terms. We're not going to be put it into these categories of Greek and Latin. We're going to focus on the spoken form of that language. And we are going to deal with such issues as how language is actually acquired. Now, one thing we're going to share with traditional grammar, however, is how our analysis works out. We're still going to be taxonomizers. We're still going to be interested in categorization and subcategorization, but we want the categories and the subcategories to be logical, consistent, because we're letting the language speak for itself. In other words, there's a strong empirical bent here. Let the language speak for itself. Everybody kind of with me on how attitudes are beginning to change here in the realm of language study. And this particular school of grammatical theory, or this particular grammatical theory, lasts, as I said, until the 1950s or around 1960 when Chomsky appears on the scene. And these people make tremendous strides in language analysis. The phonology that we're going to be doing in this class, guess who came up with most of that? These people. The phonemics, these people. The suprasegmentals, these people. Our approach to morphology, these people. They took language theory and really ran with it. Now, the guy who does the most with this in the United States, anybody know his name? He's not really the founder. The guy who writes the first book is an American linguistic anthropologist named Franz Boas, but it's his student who becomes the dominant player in the United States.
I'm taking a guess. Sapir?
Sapir would have been, but he died. He was in competition with this guy. And Sapir would have probably been the major figure if he had lived longer. This guy's name was Bloomfield. First name Leonard. And he is so important that a lot of people call American structural theory, they call it Bloomfieldian linguistics. In 1933, this guy writes a book called Language. Now, if you have nothing to do some Saturday night and you want to get a little laugh, Google the title Language. Okay? And what you're going to see is there are about 18,000 different books called Language that were written between 1920 and 1950 or 60. That's because every structural linguist worth his or her salt had to write a book, and the book had to be called Language. Okay, so this is Bloomfield's Language, published in 1933, but it becomes the Bible, in essence, of American structural grammar. Now, there are some differences. I don't want to give you the idea that all the structuralists are exactly the same. There are some twists and turns, depending on whether you're a Geneva School structuralist, or you're an American structuralist, or you're a Prague School structuralist. And one of the things that made American structuralism unique was their dislike of semantics. Their argument was that we shouldn't study semantics. We shouldn't study semantics because you can't study it scientifically. And one of Bloomfield's favorite examples, I'll spare you the long one, I'll give you just one of the short ones, was Adam. He wrote the book in 1933. He says, we can't talk about atoms because we don't know enough about atoms. So he says, let the lexicographers, who are they? They're the dictionary writers. Let them play with that stuff because we know they're not very scientific anyway. We want to be scientific, so we're not going to study meaning because meaning is this slippery slope that gets you into trouble. Well, the Europeans, they thought this was a real hoot. And one of the European structuralists said it best. In fact, he came to the United States in the late 1930s. He was a Czech, but he was a Czech Jew, and he knew what Hitler was up to. And so his name was Roman Jakobson. And he escaped from Czechoslovakia before the Nazis took over and taught at Harvard University for many years as a linguist there. But one of his favorite sayings about American structuralism, he said, the study of language without meaning is meaningless. Right in the gut. And there's a certain truth to that. But there's some good things, believe it or not, that actually came from American structuralism's dislike of semantics. They were much more precise in their definition of a lot of syntactic concepts. So it worked out a little bit. But anyway, I don't want to give you the idea that everybody who was a structuralist between 1900 and 1960, we were on the same page. Even people like Sapir and Bloomfield fought about certain issues. Bloomfield was a real stickler for science. Everything had to be absolutely scientific. Sapir was a little looser. And you might suspect that given the fact that most of you know about Sapir from Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, which is pretty speculative. So he was a little looser in his view of science than Bloomfield. But the point is, there's a lot of sharing of ideas, but there are some differences as well. But with me on the general theory, how it works. So when we get into some structural grammar later on, we're going to play with things like this. I have two sentences here. I look up the reference. I look the reference up. How do those sentences sound to you? They're the same. They're basically the same sentence. They're fine. But if you're a prescriptivist, see, now let's go back and look at this from the point of view of traditional theory. They don't like number 2. Why? They say that you're ending a sentence with a preposition. So you're supposed to only say, I look up the reference, not I look the reference up. Now, the problem here is that they call this a preposition. And the point that the structuralist made is that is not a preposition. And they proved it. They would try, empirically to show that this is not a preposition. But see, if you only have 8 parts of speech, if that's all God has given you, 8 parts of speech, you've got to find for every word a home in one of those 8 parts of speech. So the poor traditionalists, they're looking at this up in look up, and they're saying to themselves, where does this go? This is like the Hopi, or like the Navajo to some extent, and their weird classes of items. Well, let's put it as a preposition, because after all, there is a preposition up, as in, I walked up the hill. But the only problem is, from the structuralist point of view, this up
It's different.
is not this up. They're 2 different ups. Now, we have lots of words in English that sound alike and they're different words. See, if I said to you, bear, what did I just say? Well, there's a verb, bear, which means to carry. There's also a verb, bear, which means to tolerate. There's also a verb, bear, which means give birth to. Okay? So, but then there's bear, which is the animal. Then there's bear. Don't pay attention to spelling because we are looking at the spoken form, not the written. There's the adjective, meaning naked. So these are called homonyms or homophones. English is full of them. Most languages have them. So it shouldn't come as any great surprise that you could have an up, which is one part of speech, and an up, which is another part of speech. And that seems to be what's going on here if you're a structuralist. But see, if you're a traditionalist, you're stuck because you can't find a home for up. And one of the things the structuralists pointed out was, well, if this up is the same as this up, then the sentences structurally should work the same way. And one of the things that we can do with prepositional phrases is move them. So I could say, up the hill I walk, or I walk up the hill. Now, if this is a preposition, I should be able to say, up the reference I look. And you laugh at that because, no, that's not the way it works. And there's other syntactic evidence here, too, that this up and this up are not the same. In fact, those of you teaching ESL, you probably know where we're headed here. What's up in look up?
Phrasal verb.
This is a phrasal verb, okay? In other words, the verb here is look up. It operates as one lexical item, and the up is called a verbal particle. The verbal particle is part of the phrasal verb. So this is the entire verb.
But don't traditionalists have the same problem when they look at Latin verb combinations? The only difference being that in Latin it's all one word. But they don't see an issue with that at all.
And those of you who study German, this is kind of like what's going on with the German separable prefixes. The Germanic languages doing different things from Latin and Greek. If you don't know what that means, don't worry about it. But the point is, in structural grammar, we don't have to say something idiotic This is a preposition and this is a preposition. We let the language speak for itself, in which case this can be part of the verb. A verb particle is part of the phrasal verb, and this can be the genuine preposition. So that's the kind of thing that the structuralists started to do. There are no verbal particles in traditional grammar. There are no phrasal verbs in traditional grammar, but this seems to be a much more accurate way of characterizing the way the English language actually works. Any native English speaker will tell you that I looked the reference up sounds perfectly fine, unless you've been kind of brainwashed by traditional grammar where they told you not to say this. But let's face it, it sounds okay, because this is not ending a sentence with a preposition. This is a different entity altogether. Anyway, everybody with me on kinds of things they were playing with. Okay, 1957 rolls around. A relatively unknown linguist by the name of Noam Chomsky publishes that little book called Syntactic Structures. Couldn't get the darn book published in the United States. Why? It was too radical. Publishers wouldn't touch it. It was just so far off the deep end that the poor guy had to go to this little wee printing press in The Hague, in the Netherlands, called Mouton, to publish the book. Well, of course, the irony there is that in subsequent years, that little unknown printing press became a major publisher of theoretical linguistics. In fact, there is no Mouton anymore. Walter de Gruyter, the largest German publishing house, bought out Mouton for I forget how many tens of millions of dollars a few years ago. But so there was a kind of irony there that this little press actually published this book by this unknown linguist. There is talk, and again I'm gossiping here, people have denied it, but it's still a topic of conversation in the field of linguistics, that when Chomsky was circulating the manuscript for Syntactic Structures, a guy by the name of Bernard Bloch, who was president of the Linguistic Society of America, was so against what Chomsky was up to, he found it apparently very threatening, that he contacted publishers and said, if you publish his book, I will see to it that the membership in the Linguistic Society of America will not use your company's textbooks in their classes. Now, Bloch is dead. He denied it while he was alive, but there are people who said that they heard him say this. But the point is, whether or not there was actually that degree of sabotaging Chomsky's ideas or not, he had one devil of a time getting this book published because of its radical nature. And so, when the book appears, however, people look at it and say, wow, this guy is on to something. There were mass conversions of structuralists, which is amazing because, once you write your doctoral dissertation, the last thing you want to do is to say it was a bunch of baloney. And that's what you'd have to do if you were a structural linguist and you were going to adopt the generative approach. But Chomsky was a smart guy. And if you know anything about Chomsky, he is quite an operator. Most of you know him not as a linguist, but as a political theorist. And he kind of had to separate his politics from his linguistics. His politics...
Wasn't he a radical communist?
Yeah, well, communist is too